How's it going, everybody? Welcome into the Skyline Sports Podcast. I am your host, Jack Hartman, joined as always by my co-host on the West Coast, Nick Norman. Nick, how you doing today, man?
Doing well, doing well. In that festive kind of mood, the holidays are getting here. And so
Ooh.
just enjoying that post Thanksgiving, almost Christmas time kind of feel. So just happy to be here with you, Jack. How are you doing out there in Texas?
Doing well. It is finally starting to be cold. For those of you that don't know, Nick and I met in college in Massachusetts, so we know cold, and we also know hot because of where we're living now, also. And so cold for here, it's still like we're in the 50s, low 60s. So not really all that cold, but it is what it is.
Yep, indeed. So we've got a lot of college football stuff going on today, Jack. As you can see on the screen, we've got the top 25 currently right now. And we've got conference championship weekend coming up. We've got a bunch of conference championship games that have implications with the new 12-team playoff format. We've got 5 automatic bids for conference champions that you and I will probably agree, probably 3 of them are up in the air as far as the teams that win will make the playoffs. The team that lose will miss them. And so it's really going to be tight runnings there. And so leading off, we've just got the college football rankings for this week. What are you feeling about the current rankings? We've got the whole list of teams here. Like, what are your reactions, especially bunch of SEC teams, bunch of 3-loss SEC teams we got here? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't understand these rankings. I feel like, and we see from year to year with the playoff, like things that when it was the 14 playoff, it's like, oh well, last year how good your losses were was really important, and this year it's how good your wins are is really important. And so I feel like we've seen that this year, even from week to week, those things change. And even I feel like in this one, within the top 25, we're seeing that, and I mean, obviously my biggest thought when it comes to this is my own team, Syracuse. But I look at them compared to the teams above them. Illinois, Syracuse has a much better resume than UNLV. Syracuse already beat this year. Missouri doesn't have a win against a top 25 team. So like there are a few of these that I'm like, okay, why is Syracuse where they are? But like for example, Alabama lost to Oklahoma, but they're still where they are, right? When it comes to these things. So I feel like there's a little bit of some weird stuff there. The biggest thing to me, and leaving my bias as a Syracuse fan out of it, is I don't see how Ohio State can lose at home to a 6-win Michigan team and only drop 2 spots, but Miami can lose on the road to an 8-win Syracuse team and drop 6 spots. Like I understand, like their wins are different, but the thing is, like, this is a week by week thing, right? And so like there's no reason that if we're taking their body of work beforehand, which had Ohio State at 4, Michigan at 6, or excuse me, Miami at 6, and after both of them losing this week and the way that they lost, that makes Miami that much worse than Ohio State to me. That one doesn't make sense to me. I am happy to see where SMU is. I think they deserve to be as high as they are. I think whether they win or lose this week, they deserve to make the college football playoff, and we'll talk about that when we talk conference championships in a little bit. But I'm happy that they're where they are. A lot of people thought they might be on the chopping block, so I'm glad that they are where they are because they absolutely deserve it.
Mm-hmm. I hear you there, Jack. As we're going to talk about a little later here, there's this kind of dynamic nature of how good are your wins, how good are your losses. And then it seems like there's this big third component that the committee always takes into these rankings with, like, well, how good's your roster? How good do we think you are just as a team? Even though you've played games on the field, how good is your roster? Of course,
Yeah.
the top 5, 6, 7 teams stacked, just super talented rosters full of 5 stars. But as you were saying, for a team like Miami to drop a number of spots for losing to you said it was a three or four loss. You
3
have
losses.
3 losses right now for Syracuse.
Yeah.
And then Ohio State for a 5-loss Michigan team losing to them. It just feels like the committee's being a little beholden to Ohio State. We think they're up there. So even though they just had a worse loss than Miami, we just think they're better than Miami in the first place. So let's just penalize them a little bit less. And so I feel like there's this kind of unspoken, well, it's like, well, we think they're better on the field, but the results aren't lining up with that as much. And so I feel like it's kind of counterintuitive in some ways. So I completely feel where you're at with that.
I think if I would just like to know, and this is the biggest thing that I really don't like about this whole committee thing, is like, I mean, granted, every week after the rankings are announced, the chair of the committee, gets interviewed, has to answer some questions, but like when it comes to we just think this team is better. The pushback that I would give to that is Miami has statistically the best offense in college football this year. And statistically, they have the 24th best defense. They are one of 7 teams that are in the top 25 for both offense and defense this year. And so, like, I just want to know what the thing is that they're seeing that is like, well, Ohio State's this much better, right? Like, oh, there are these, 5 other teams that we're going to put higher than Miami. I'm just like, can you elaborate? Can you explain what is it that, when it comes to this on the field thing? That being said, and I talked about SMU already, but Jim Phillips, the commissioner of the ACC, made it very clear that SMU deserves to be up there before the rankings came out, because last year Florida State, their quarterback Jordan Travis, was injured, and even though they went undefeated and won the ACC, they did not make the college football playoff because of it. And Jim Phillips was very clear that, like, yes, SMU has a loss, but since they changed to their current quarterback, they are 9-0. And so, if we're doing this whole thing like, oh, well, that guy got injured and so he's not there anymore, he's like, then it better work in the positive as well. And so I'm glad that we're seeing that. But yeah, I feel like it's just this weird, this committee is in this conference room, they make these decisions and then they drop them out. And then like, that's it. It's like in the Disney Plus show Loki with the timekeepers, right? Like they just decide this is the timeline and then poof, that's how it is. And it isn't until Loki's like, no, I want to get to the bottom of this, right? Like that we actually find out anything. I feel like there's a little shroud of that here in with the committee and their rankings.
Mm-hmm. I hear you there. I feel like we were definitely getting that kind of sense with Indiana specifically, where it's like, well, Indiana's not a traditional power. Like, well, we don't think their roster is that talented. They got a bunch of transfers that followed the head coach from their old spot to the new spot. I feel like they're just like, okay, this isn't that talented of a team, but they're winning a bunch of games. The moment they lose, we're going to drop them a big chunk. Like they're still in the top 10 right now, clearly. Yeah. But I feel like the committee's just kind of preying on that kind of team's downfall, like a Florida State last year, where it's like that team was really talented, but because of the loss of Jordan Travis, they're like, hey, we think this team isn't as talented as the other teams, but they're 13-0. So the moment they slip up, we'll want to drop them. They never slipped up, and yet they were still penalized in that way. I feel like the committee's just trying to keep an eye out for those kind of teams and kind of preying on their downfall a little bit. And so I feel like SMU could be one of those teams. I think Indiana. I think Boise State's kind of similar to the Cincinnati team a couple of years ago that was a bid for the college football playoffs. I feel like those teams that just aren't the traditional teams you think of with good college football teams. They're like, okay, they may be winning, but do we really believe in them? And so it just feels like because there's no system right now to be like, okay, your strength of schedule takes into this much account of if you're going to make the playoffs, or these conference championships, like they will make it, but it also doesn't take into account the other like wild card type teams that are just at large bids. It feels like we need a strong formula of, okay, if you have X number of wins and your strength of schedule or strength of record are these kind of things, that's how you make it, rather than the subjective opinions of people would really help, but doesn't feel like we're getting that anytime soon. So,
Yep.
Yeah. Yes. Moving on, we got the current bracket, I believe. Yeah. So this is the current projected bracket that we have in mind. So as far as this being the current potential bracket right now, Jack, Boise State's obviously in there, SMU's obviously in there based on the current rankings, Arizona State's in there. These are definitely some potential conference champions that their conference championships are anything but a lockup, where you believe potentially Boise State could lose to UNLV, SMU could lose as well in the ACC, and Arizona State in the Big 12. What are your feelings about what the committee is going to do with all these potential conference champions? What it's going to look like as far as how they're going to parse out, okay, what if the favorite wins compared to what if the underdog wins, and how you're going to rank out who are the best champions out of these and how you're going to fit them into this potential bracket.
Yeah, so I think first of all, one of the most important things with this is that it is, you are really, really happy if you're Alabama right now being in the 11 spot. We sort of have this slew of teams from 11 to 14 of Alabama, Miami, Ole Miss, and South Carolina. And because there are 5 automatic bids for conference champions, if you're in the top 12, it doesn't necessarily mean anything, because as we have it right now, no team from the Big 12 is in the top 12. Or no team competing for the Big 12 championship is in the top 12. And so it's really, really important. It's not good enough just to be in the top 12. Like you need to be in the top 10, and I think we're going to come to see that next year a lot more, thinking about that of, hey, we can't just be the cut line. We need to be above the cut line in case that cut line changes. And so I think that it's really, really important looking at these matchups. Alabama's in a really, really good position right now that they're in 11, and right now they're in it. But I honestly, this is my prediction. I predict that UNLV is going to upset Boise State. And so in theory, that would move, in this case, Arizona State up to 4, and UNLV would slide into 12. The question you then have to ask, does the committee value Boise State enough that they're still going to make it, even if they lose that championship? I think that as much as Alabama fans are thinking that the system is perfect right now because it has them where they're at, they're going to flip on ahead really, really quick if they get bumped out because the committee keeps Boise State in. The other thing that you have to look at is Clemson SMU. If Clemson wins that game, I think it would be absolutely ridiculous if SMU falls out of the college football playoff, because if that happens, the precedent that the committee is setting is that it is better to be 2-loss Ohio State and not even playing in your conference championship game than to be good enough to get into your conference championship game. The reason that we expanded the playoff was to get more teams in, but we added the automatic qualifiers, the automatic bids, because we really want to value winning your conference championship. Already there are teams looking at it. You have people looking at it and saying, you know what? It's better to be number 5 than it is to be a conference champion, right? Mm-hmm. That is bad enough that we're already thinking that way, let alone thinking that it's better to not even play in your conference championship. Ward Manuel, the chair of the committee, said on Tuesday night when after the rankings came out, he said, one, that teams that are not playing this week are set in stone where they're at because they don't have, in his words, another data point to compare against everybody else, which I think is a load of crap, but that's just me personally. And then second, he said that there is a chance if SMU loses, they fall out of the top 12. And that is just so backwards and wrong if that happens. I mean, you were talking about earlier, like this, like, can we have some sort of formula of like this happens and then this happens and then this happens, this percentage is weighed this is weighed this. And the fact is, that was the BCS. That was the BCS. That was the formula. Everyone hated it because they didn't understand it. And now here we are that we're like, actually, it's become way too subjective and we want it to be a little more objective. And so my biggest concern, macro wise, for the sake of the college football playoff, is, does SMU fall out if they lose to Clemson? Because if that's what happens, then we just need to scrap this whole playoff thing altogether, or walk it back to 4 teams, right? Because again, being penalized for playing in your conference championship is just ridiculous. It's already bad enough that people are saying, like, does Dan Lanning in Oregon try to lose this week so that they can slot into that 5 spot and then have a much easier path by having to play like a tune-up game against Arizona State and then play Boise State, a team that they've already beaten? Instead of having to play Ohio State again, like, it's bad that we're even talking that way. And so that's more of the macro level stuff. On the more micro level, I think that you are really, really frustrated if you're Tennessee right now, compared to Ohio State. I think that if you're Tennessee, you're like, really, we have to go to Columbus. Like, we have arguably a better resume than Ohio State does. On top of that, not only do we have to go to Columbus, if we win, we have to go out to Eugene, Oregon also. I think if you're Notre Dame, you are sitting as best as you could possibly be. Join a conference and you can be better. But like, you're going to be like, oh, why do we have to play against Alabama? It's like, well, that's the situation you're in. So the one thing that I am intrigued by is I don't think that we're actually going to have many blowouts if this is what happens. My one concern is that Indiana-Georgia game, just because we saw what, happened to Indiana against Ohio State. I hope it isn't a blowout. I honestly hope even for an upset, just because, we look back at the college football playoff in the past. Cincinnati did get their chance to get into the 14 college football playoff. Notre Dame got their chance to get into the 14 college football playoff. They both got blown out, and then everyone's like, well, see, this is why we don't put these teams in here, right? And so I don't want that to happen for the sake of the playoff, for the sake of being a fan of a team that is more like an Indiana than an Ohio State, right? And that, I want them to still be able to get the chance instead of the committee being like, they're not worth it. Let's also put in 3-loss Ole Miss instead of, or whatever, something like that. So I do think it'll be really interesting with conference championships this weekend. I'd be surprised if Oregon loses, but it could happen. And what does that do to Penn State? I do think Boise State's going to lose to UNLV. Does Boise State fall all the way out? I think they do. I think they should. I think that if the committee kept Alabama in, and not Miami, and then Boise State loses and doesn't fall out of the playoff, Miami fans and ACC fans would have quite the gripe with that, because the thing with Miami is like, well, who did you beat? It's like, who did Boise State beat at that point? The Texas-Georgia game is really, really interesting because of how wide of a margin they are seeded-wise right now, with Texas at 2 and Georgia at 7. Of the conference championship games that are happening between two teams already in the bracket, that's the biggest disparity. And so if Georgia wins, do they move all the way up to 2? Does Texas fall all the way to 7? Or does Texas fall to 5 and everybody else kind of slots down? Notre Dame ends up in 7, Penn State in 6. How does that all shake out? It'll just be really, really interesting.
I hear you there. I feel like Texas, because their only loss is to Georgia, that people are feeling like, well, we've already seen this formula of Georgia being able to beat Texas. And Carson Beck didn't even play well that day at all.
No.
And yet they still beat them pretty soundly, 30-15, I believe.
But
it's like, okay, Georgia, if they win this game, they're a 2-loss team. But they lose this game, they're a 3-loss team. And Alabama beat them, and they're right at that threshold line. A 3-loss Georgia team after that, I don't. But the thing is, I think honestly that people are like, we think Georgia's a really, really good team, and yet they just struggled with Georgia Tech just last week. And losing to Texas, I think it's really on the table. They fall out of this whole thing, although people think they're really good. I think they lose to Texas. I think if Texas loses, though, obviously, I think both teams make the playoffs and they both keep pretty high seeding. But
Right.
I think that the potential of Georgia falling out of the whole thing, when Alabama, people are already annoyed about a 3-loss Alabama being in the picture right now, having a really real shot. I also look at the 8, 9, and 10 seed right now with Ohio State, Tennessee, Indiana. I've seen posts around a good bit lately about Tennessee that it's like, well, Tennessee has 2 losses and they're just going to be able to chill at home during the SEC championship and not have to sweat. They're not a 3-loss SEC team. They feel locked in. And the fact that they didn't make the SEC championship being a reason why they don't have to sweat it out kind of bothers me too. Where Georgia, if they didn't make the SEC championship, it's really on the table that they just are in Tennessee's spot right now, where they just get to chill at home and have no risk whatsoever over this weekend. And so teams not making their championship game, and it's not that they're rewarded, but it's that the risk is completely mitigated. I'm not a fan of that. You want games to have a lot of risk. You want there to be variance. You want the best teams to win, obviously, but you don't want teams to be able to be without having to worry about all the other outcomes going on. You want there to be impact on everybody.
Yeah.
And Ohio State gets to chill at home. Indiana gets to chill at home. And they just don't have to worry about any of this. They get to not have to sweat it out. They are all locks right now. And the fact that the conference championships have an impact for the teams in it, but the teams who aren't in it don't get impacted as much is kind of crazy to me. That's pretty nuts to me. And so curious with that.
Yeah. Can you go back to the top 25 for a sec? Because one of the other things that I think it's important to talk about is that 11 through 14 section. Alabama right now is in that pole position, as we talked about. Miami would be the first team out. And then you also have Ole Miss there and South Carolina, who's probably the hottest team in college football right now. And I think it's really, really interesting looking at these 4 teams and why they're ranked where they are. So I'm going to kind of give like the argument for each team as to why they should be where Alabama is. And so we'll start with Alabama. Their argument, they beat Georgia, they beat LSU, they beat South Carolina, and they beat Missouri. I mean, they have quite the slew of wins there. They have 3 wins versus ranked SEC teams compared to Ole Miss, who only has 1. And they're like, we already beat South Carolina, so like they shouldn't be there. You look at Miami. They're undefeated against teams under 500, which teams under 500. Well, both Bama and Ole Miss have losses there. Ole Miss lost to Kentucky. Bama lost to Oklahoma and Vanderbilt, who ended up being 500 teams, but still not good. And Miami is 4-2 versus bowl eligible teams. Bama and South Carolina each have 3 losses versus bowl eligible teams, right? So that's the argument for Miami. Yes, they don't have a flashy win like Bama or Ole Miss does or South Carolina does, but they did their job against the teams that they should, right? Then you get to Ole Miss. And Ole Miss's argument, I personally doing this, I feel like Ole Miss is actually the team that deserves to be 11 out of these 4 teams. Here's Ole Miss. They beat South Carolina on the road 27-3. Alabama beat South Carolina at home 27-25. Ole Miss beat Oklahoma 26-14. Bama lost to Oklahoma 24-3. Ole Miss beat Georgia 28-10. Bama beat Georgia, and it was 41-34. And if you look at that, body of work, I think that there's a real argument there for Ole Miss to actually be the team at 11 instead of Alabama. And then last we got South Carolina. Like I said, they're the hottest team in college football. They've got 6 straight wins. Their worst loss is to 8-4 LSU by 3 points. Ole Miss's worst loss is to 4-8 Kentucky by 3 points. Bama's worst loss is to 6-6 Oklahoma by 21 points. Right. So if we're evaluating losses really high, then South Carolina definitely has a point to be made there. Furthermore, those 2 teams that Ole Miss and Bama lost to in Kentucky and Oklahoma, South Carolina beat Kentucky by 25 points, and they beat Oklahoma by 26. So against teams that those 2 teams stumbled against, South Carolina took care of business. And I feel like this is really, really important to talk about because, like I was mentioning earlier, sort of how does the pie work? How much of the pie are we attributing to your best wins? How much of it are we attributing to your worst losses? How much are we attributing to your strength of record and strength of schedule? And I think it's really, really interesting if you can actually put up the strength of record and strength of schedule slide here. When you look at this, how different things are between strength of record and strength of schedule. So a lot of teams want to talk about strength of schedule. A lot of SEC people want to talk about the strength of schedule, right? Like we play in the SEC, it's so much harder. And, I will give you the credit that if you're looking at the strength of schedule, I mean, Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama are top 3 in that. And these 12 teams, what I put together here for both of these is I went through and looked at everyone's strength of record, looked at everyone's strength of schedule, and fitting the parameters of the 12-team playoff, put together what that 12-team playoff would look like outside of seeding the top 4, but making sure that you have 5 conference champions and all of that. And so you look at strength of schedule, right? Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, they're up where they are. But if you move further down, Illinois is the number 7 team in the country when it comes to strength of schedule. No one is arguing that 9-3 Illinois should be in the top 25 because they have a hard strength of schedule, but they lost to those hard teams, right? You notice that Indiana isn't on there. You notice that Oregon, undefeated Oregon in the Big Ten, is not on there for that strength of schedule, right? So I just want to step back and just hey, put this out there. Like Marshall would be the group of 5 team that makes the college football playoff, assuming they win their conference championship game. If we're really just evaluating on strength of schedule. Now, we aren't, obviously, there's lots of factors, but people really want to talk about strength of schedule. And I just want to put this out there okay, this is strength of schedule, right? Clemson is the number 10 team in the country with strength of schedule because they played Georgia and South Carolina. They played the top 2 teams on there. Now, they got blown out by Georgia and they lost to South Carolina. So you think, well, that on top of losing to, I think it was Louisville, you're well, they shouldn't be in it. I agree. But you want to talk about strength of schedule, this is what we're seeing. Missouri doesn't have a win against a top 25 team, but they're number 5 team in the country with strength of schedule because strength of schedule is not strength of record. Strength of schedule just takes into account who you played against. It doesn't take into account what you did against them. Compared to the top strength of record, which I think we all would agree looks a little bit better, right? Oregon, Georgia, Texas, Penn State, Notre Dame, Ohio State, Tennessee, Indiana, SMU, Alabama, Boise State, Iowa State. In theory, that's basically the 12 teams that are going to make the playoff, right? So let's back up on the strength of schedule thing. Let's talk more about strength of record because strength of record I think is a little bit more important. Now, the thing that I really, really struggle with, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, is listen, are we evaluating wins most? Are we evaluating losses most? Are we evaluating strength of record or strength of schedule most? And I think that if it were me, again, it's not me. I'm just a guy here on this podcast with you, Nick. But if it were me, I would really, really look at losses. Obviously wins, but losses would be probably the most important thing to me because if we want the 12 best teams in the playoff, we need to look at their entire body of work. And part of their body of work is their losses. So Alabama has a really high ceiling. They beat Georgia, right? They have a really high ceiling. They also have a floor of a team that got blown out and lost by 3 touchdowns to Oklahoma. Okay. you know, maybe you look at Miami and who they played against, and their ceiling isn't as high. Sure, I'll give you that. But their losses were to Georgia Tech, who ended at 7-5, but took Georgia to 8 overtimes in Athens, and to 9-3 Syracuse, who has beaten Miami, has beaten UNLV, and has beaten Georgia Tech. Right? I'd say their floor, if we're looking at their resumes, their floor is a lot higher than Alabama's floor. And so I think, like we just it's Jekyll and Hyde with this Alabama team, right? So let's say they're playing Notre Dame in South Bend in the first round of the playoffs. The Alabama team that beat Georgia could show up and could beat Notre Dame and then go on to beat SMU and then go on to beat whoever's next and end up making it to the national championship team. The Alabama team that showed up against Oklahoma is getting blown out by Notre Dame, right? And I think we need to look at that. We look at Notre Dame, the Notre Dame team that finished the rest of the season, the Notre Dame team that beat the brakes off of Army looks incredible. The Notre Dame team that lost at home to Northern Illinois could get absolutely blown out by Alabama at home if the Georgia version of Alabama shows up, right? And so I feel like there's not enough weight being attributed to that. And when I think of who is the best team, I'm thinking about who has the highest floor, and then on top of that, highest ceiling as well. But if someone's floor is here and their ceiling is here, I believe in them more than a team whose floor is all the way down here and their ceiling is up here. And so I think for the sake of having good football, for having a good playoff, like the committee really needs to think about that. And maybe that means that an 11-1 Indiana team doesn't make the playoff, right? And that would really stink if you're Indiana. You're thinking you're 11-1. You're thinking we didn't have control over the teams we played. Like the Big Ten decided what our schedule is going to be this year, but that's just in this world of expanded conferences where it's not like, listen, we can bank on the fact that we're playing Ohio State and Penn State and Michigan every year, like it used to be for Indiana. Syracuse had a really easy schedule this year. Next year, they play Tennessee and Atlanta. They play Notre Dame on the road. They play SMU on the road. They play Miami on the road, and they also play Clemson, I'm pretty sure, right? Before the expansion, they knew we're playing NC State, we're playing Louisville, we're playing Clemson, we're playing Florida State every year. But we're also playing Wake Forest. We're playing Boston College, right? We're probably playing Virginia, so like you at least knew, right? And now in this era of expanded playoff, expanded college conferences, the transfer portal, NIL, you have teams that are building teams, not programs anymore. You have schools building teams, not programs. It's basically like if in the NFL every single year everybody was an unrestricted free agent is basically how it is. Every single year anybody can go wherever they want to, and can open it up like that with the transfer portal and with NIL. And on top of it, because these conferences are so big, you could be Indiana, you could be Texas, right? That you play one good team in your conference every year, and if you lose that game, it's like shoot, right? And so I think all of it we're just seeing this year with this expanded playoff, like, okay, do we need to walk this back a little bit? Like, do we need to recognize, like, hey, we've got some issues? Does a conference need to, like the Big Ten or like the SEC, think, hey, maybe we should have 3 divisions, right? It's always been 2 divisions. Maybe we should have 3 divisions, and the top 2 teams that win or of the 3 division winners, the top 2 teams when it comes to record against the conference, right? They're the ones that are playing in the conference championship. You're going to have a team that gets upset from that 3rd division, but then at least there's some sort of, the Big Ten can have control. Every commissioner right now of each league is arguing why their team should be in it. Like, help yourself out, set yourself up for success. Jim Phillips is preaching to the choir about the ACC, about SMU, about Miami, about Clemson right now. It's like, you know what? Set your conference up for success. by making things not easier, but making it so you have more balance like that. So SMU can be like, hey, we have one loss, and our one loss is to the only team that's ranked in the college football playoff rankings right now. But we, also beat these teams that are really good too. So that's I've been going on for a while, but
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you though, Jack. I feel like we are clearly, with the first year of the 12-team playoffs, it's clear and obvious that we're in an era of change, that college football is changing and transforming into something else. And that's okay. It's good. College football has been flawed for many, many years, have a lot of funky things about that. The way that schedules are built, as you said, the way that divisions and conferences are constructed and how they do things, very weird. NIL, the last couple of years, NIL becoming a thing, has been changing and shifting what things have been like. I feel like we're in the first steps of what things are going to look like, but it seems like there are a lot of things that still need to change. As we've said, it feels like there's still a level of subjectivity with what's going on with the playoffs and what the committee's doing. As you were saying, it feels like some of these conference championship games, it feels a little weird how they're trying to put together who's in which champion or what teams are making it and how the divisions are separated out. It feels like the committee as well is trying to figure out, okay, are we valuing ceiling or floor more, or record or strength of schedule, or which part of that? And so it seems like college football, which is a great sport, lots of energy, lots of awesome games. I think that's awesome. But it feels like now more than ever, it's getting clearer and more obvious that there are a lot of things that need to be fine tuned to get to a place of stability. It feels like we're still not in that place of stability. And it seems like there's still many changes that need to be made. I still think this is going to be an amazing year of the playoffs. I think 12 teams. I think, as you said before, there are going to be not quite as many blowouts as the last couple of years with the 4-team playoffs. It feels like you'd see a TCU get in. And although TCU upset Michigan, like, that's awesome for TCU, they also got shellacked in the national championship by Georgia. Like, I don't know that in the first couple of rounds we're going to see any type of shellacking like a 65-7, I think that game was. It feels like it's going to be very competitive with the era of NIL. I think that it's going to be really awesome in terms of, I think there are going to be a lot more players picking different schools because nobody's going to want to be a backup at the same school when you can get offered money to be a starter in other spots. I think it's going to be a really fun era of parity potentially in this NIL 12-team playoff era.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot to be excited about with that. It still does feel, though, that last year with Florida State not making the playoffs as a 13-0 team was a canary in the coal mine for that and was kind of the last nail in the coffin for the 4-team. But it still feels like with the 12-team, we've got our gripes. And people are always going to have their gripes about so-and-so team should have made it over this SEC team or Big Ten team. That seems like it's going to happen forever. But we should still be doing what we can, or the committee should be doing what they can to try and figure out a system to minimize that.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think on the ranking show, I think, or maybe it was yesterday, watching Get Up or Pat McAfee show, like someone was talking about, like, all of these teams, we're evaluating, like, oh, how many wins do you have against ranked teams, right? And it's like, okay, 25 is such an arbitrary number, right? Like, if you look at it, South Carolina, because Texas A&M isn't ranked, lost a ranked win, right, where they absolutely destroyed Texas A&M. That makes their resume look better. If we're looking at the AP poll, I'm pretty sure that Texas A&M is like the first team out that, they're the first team out that was, receiving votes, but just didn't quite have enough votes to get into the top 25, And so I feel like as we expand to this point that half of the teams being ranked are making the playoff, it might be time to expand the rankings a little bit, right? Just to help give a fuller sense of that, because Texas A&M is just barely out. Louisville is just barely out. They would be 27. SMU beat Louisville, right? That's a good win for them that now doesn't mean as much. Duke is just barely out. Clemson beat Duke, right? They're just barely out. Kansas State, you had Iowa State beat them. So there's just more of this, like, okay, as other things expand, it means that other things are going to have to expand, So as the conferences expanded, the playoff expanded. Like, great. We needed that, right? Well, where else does there need to be expansion? Where else do we need to branch out? Just for the sake of making things seem a little bit better, right? When it was a 14 playoff, and yeah, the 26 through 30 teams, right? Like, they're not ranked, they don't count as ranked wins. It's like, okay, well, you know what? Like, it's a 14 playoff, which means like 6 teams are potentially getting in. Well, now it's a 12-team playoff. There's like 15 to 17 teams that, like, they're trying to push and make an argument for it. And so let's help that conversation and do everything we can to help get a more accurate understanding and representation of teams' resumes. And I think potentially expanding the rankings maybe to the top 30 could be a really, really good way of doing that.
Mm-hmm. I hear you, because you're just saying let's just add more context. Because why is it we have this threshold of 25 and we say, okay, the top 25 is this good, but then after that, it's just the rest of the teams.
Yeah.
What about teams with winning records compared to teams with losing records? Like, how
Right.
are we weighing? You just beat a team that has 2 wins. You just beat a team that has 6 wins. Neither of them are in the top 25, but one of those wins was a cakewalk, and the other one of them was a dogfight you got into. Both of them aren't top 25, but those are very different wins.
Yeah, exactly. Syracuse, 8 of their 9 wins came to bowl eligible teams this year, right? Mm-hmm. Like, okay, let's talk about that. How many other teams in college football have 8 wins against bowl eligible teams, right? Like, I know that Texas doesn't. Now, I'm not saying that Syracuse is better than Texas, but again, like, obviously, if we're evaluating and if there's so much in the shadows about this evaluation process that we can't understand, let's at least make it as easy as we can to understand this process by doing something like that, by expanding the rankings to 30, by, instead of talking about strength of schedule, talking about strength of record, by talking about wins against bowl eligible teams, which means you're at least 500 or better, instead of talking about wins against ranked teams. Because again, Florida State was a ranked win for a lot of people. They're 2-10 this year, right? That shouldn't count as a ranked win for people, because it's like, oh, well, they were ranked at the time of playing them. It's like, who cares? Especially early in the season. Like, I do not care whatsoever about the AP rankings to start the year. I really don't care about them until we're like 3 or 4 weeks in, because every single year except one in the last 25 years, since from 2000 to now, and I'm including now because Florida State is going to fit into this category, there is a team that in the first AP poll of the year, in the preseason AP poll, is ranked in the top 10 that ends the year not ranked in the top 25. Now, there are multiple this year, actually, but Florida State is obviously the biggest example. There's one year that happened. That was the year that a 7-5 Texas played like the 10-2 Georgia in the Sugar Bowl and beat them. And just because of that, they're like, we have to put them in, and they got in at 25. That is the only example of that, right? So this ranked win stuff, like, let's change that. Let's expand the rankings one. Let's also make it so, as each week goes, it is ranked wins against teams that are currently ranked, right? Because if we're doing that, then that gives some other teams ranked wins in the future, because, like, hey, we beat this team, but they're actually really good. They proved it. We beat them week 2. They were 0-2 at that point. South Carolina is a great example of that. They were unranked for a while. They were 4-3 to start the year, or 3-3. They've won 6 straight. That should count as a ranked win for a lot of these teams. It doesn't, because they weren't ranked when they played them. So, like, let's just do, like you said, everything we can to add as much context to this as possible, because it is subjective, not objective. If it was objective, then it wouldn't matter, right? Because we have a computer, we have a formula that's taking all of this information in. But because it's like, no, we need to show people exactly what all of this means, the easiest way to decipher this, like you said, let's do what we can to add more context.
Mm-hmm. I'm there with you on that. It also feels like because we are so beholden to the top 25, either the current top 25 or when they played, were they in the top 25?
Mhm.
If a team isn't in the top 25, it feels like they're just part of the rest. But it's like,
Right.
hey, you're playing against Michigan. That's Michigan. They're unranked right now. They got 5 losses. But Alabama plays Mercer. Mercer's Mercer. Like,
Yeah.
you play against NIU, beat Notre Dame. Like, NIU's NIU. But the thing is, Ohio State losing to Michigan versus Notre Dame losing to NIU, those aren't equal teams. We know they're not equal teams. We weigh those differently in our mind. We know that those are different values of losses.
Yep.
And yet it doesn't seem like there's a system to say, hey, there's the top 25, there's power 4 teams. There are good power 4 teams, bowl eligible ones. We're separating this out into, okay, Syracuse beat a bunch of these bowl eligible teams. But hey, Alabama beat a bunch of this junk, a bunch of Mercer, a bunch of Central Arkansas, just random teams, Sun Belt teams. No shot at the Sun Belt.
Right.
We go with them. But there needs to be a way to contextualize, because college football is not a fair playing field. There is the Power 4. There are these conferences that do completely wacky things with their scheduling where it's clear that every team's not playing the exact same level of competition. We
Yep.
know that teams can stack their schedule. We know that their schedules have certain teams on them years out in advance. And so it just feels like, because we know that it's not a fair playing field, it's kind of like trying to figure out what's going on with a stacked deck in cards. We
Right.
know that it's not perfectly even, and that Indiana, like, they really haven't gotten a great win. But it's like, okay, they may have not gotten a great win, but like, how are we weighing the junk they've beat compared to the junk that Texas has beaten? Like, it just feels like trying to weigh that it's like, well, both of them have 1 loss right now, but in our minds, we're trying to weigh talent of Texas. Like, Texas is just more talented than Indiana. They both lost to great teams. Each of their losses are to great teams. Great relatively, because this year it doesn't seem like there are really any great teams, really good teams.
Yeah.
But it feels like there aren't really great ways thus far that we've been utilizing to be able to give that context you were talking about, to be able to flesh out what makes for a good team, a middling team, a bad team, a great team, what a really good resume looks like. It feels like there's just so much to parse through, and we need to have better systems for that. So I'm there with you.
Yeah. And I think that also would do such a good job. Everybody, especially, here where I am, everyone's like, oh, well, the SEC, it's just different here, right? And it's like, listen, Texas beat up on Mississippi State. Mississippi State won 2 games this year, like, and like you said, stack deck. And I get, you talk about that, like, well, Mississippi State was playing an SEC schedule. Sure. 100% get that. But like you said, like, okay, Syracuse has 8 wins against bowl eligible teams this year. Texas A&M has 5. I have friends that are Aggie fans that are trying to convince me, like, trying to fight with me. And I'm like, honestly, I'm not saying that Syracuse is better than Texas A&M, because I can't. They haven't played each other. They haven't played similar schedules. But the thing that I can look at is bowl eligible teams, wins against bowl eligible teams, right? And if that is the best thing that we have to compare conferences to conferences outside of non-conference play, which I think now more than ever, non-conference play is really, really important because of this expanded playoff, and like, yeah, the ACC got absolutely destroyed by the SEC in non-conference play this year, but when the ACC plays 4 non-conference games, when the SEC plays 4, when the Big Ten only plays 3, when the Big 12 only plays 3 non-conference games, you can only schedule so much, right? You can only find a way to make that work so much. Especially, like, every team is allowed to play an FCS school, and the ACC and the SEC take advantage of that. Well, if they're doing that, if Syracuse is playing Holy Cross and Alabama is playing Mercer, right? It's like, okay, do we want to compare how badly they beat those teams and then Mercer played Holy Cross in the FCS playoffs or whatever? Like, like, there's there's too many things that it's like, oh, well, we can argue this. It's like, okay, well, we can argue this. It's like, let's just find all of the common data points, or as close to the common data points as possible. And okay, when you look at those, what does it say, right? And so, sure, the SEC is a harder conference to play than the ACC. Not even going to argue with that whatsoever. I think that there are a lot of SEC teams that, like, even 4-8 Kentucky, right? Like, they upset Ole Miss, they lost to Georgia by 1 point. Like, I think they would beat Syracuse. They're 4-8. I think they could, at their best. I absolutely think they could beat Syracuse, but they're not playing. So what can we say about it? Like, it's the nature of the sport. Upsets happen too. That's also part of it, right? Like, I'm not going to say that Kentucky is better than Ole Miss because Kentucky beat Ole Miss, because obviously that's ludicrous, right? Like, there's all of this nuance. It just feels like mud. And it's like, how can we separate things? How can we make things just fit a little bit easier into boxes that we can at least understand? And I feel like part of that needs to be the committee, like, being much more outspoken about what they are. Like, when they release their rankings, like, there's a college basketball page that I follow on Instagram, and every week they do their own top 25. And when they release it, they explain why each team is in each place. Like, this team beat this team, right? This team did this. This team did this. Like, if when we got this graphic we're looking at right here, every week, like, and it was like, Oregon remains number 1 because they're undefeated. They have a really quality win against Ohio State that bolstered them up here to begin with. They haven't lost since. They've since beaten 7-5 Michigan, 6-6 Washington. Some of that, it's like, okay, Texas is number 2. Yeah, they only have 1 loss. Yes, it's to Georgia, and the other teams they've played against haven't been that good. But unlike some of these other teams, they have absolutely blown out those teams that they're supposed to beat. They also just got a really quality win against Texas A&M. Like, explanations like that. So then we can at least see, right? Like, we can at least see, like, okay, so this is why a team is here. Got it. So this is what, when we're thinking about the future, when schools are scheduling their non-conference games, because those get scheduled like 5-6 years in advance, like Syracuse can know, okay, we got to schedule some SEC teams. And, if we're as good as we're planning to be, we'll be able to beat them. It's why Syracuse is playing Tennessee next year, right? It's why Notre Dame and Ohio State did their little 2-game thing against each other. It's why, we see these big, like, non-conference games early in the year, because it's like, okay, we got to give ourselves another leg up on some of these other teams. And so I think, again, if we got, like, every year, like, hey, Notre Dame, or every week, Notre Dame is 4 because they only have 1 loss. They've won 10 straight since that loss. They absolutely destroyed Army, who the committee really values as a group of 5 team. And so, we're putting them there. It's like, got it. Cool. Noted. Now we know what we're trying to do. So
cool. I'm there with you on that. Just jumping back to this 11 through 14 range that we were hitting up before, with Miami smack in the middle of these 3-loss SEC teams. I think it's super cowardly that the committee put Miami smack in the middle of there at 12, trying to split them in the middle of all those 3-loss SEC teams. I think that's just so cowardly, in that if you put Miami above all 3 of those or below them, then you've got all these common data points between South Carolina, Ole Miss, Alabama. They've all played common opponents. They've played each other. They've got all these common data points. But it feels just super fraudulent in terms of, hey, let's just put Miami right in the middle of there, so then we don't have to compare head-to-head. We don't have to put somebody who had a worse common data point kind of thing going on between their competition over somebody who did something better, because we want to put Alabama in the front. I'm not saying they're favoring Alabama in that way, but they might be. I'm not saying directly that. They might be. But by putting Miami where they are, they don't have to compare Alabama's resume as directly to Ole Miss and to South Carolina. Because the moment you put Alabama next to Ole Miss and South Carolina, it's like, okay, Ole Miss versus Alabama. We've seen common opponents. We know what was going on with their schedules and them at those times. You can weigh those things straight up. The common person, you or me, who watch college football games here and there, we can look at their 2 schedules and their resumes next to each other, and we can say the committee's full of it or not, if we so want to. We can compare South Carolina and Ole Miss to Alabama. We can look at their 3 resumes next to each other. But the moment you put Miami right in the middle of there, you're saying, well, Alabama's better than Miami. So that's why. We're just doing that. But it's like, wait a second. You're saying they're the highest 3-loss team, and they're different from these other SEC 3-loss teams. Why? What? Why is it that you're putting Miami, a 2-loss team, who's in their conference championship, right there in the middle of all that mess? And it really just seems very cowardly.
Yeah, I think, like, the way I see it, either Miami is better than all 3 of those teams or Miami is worse than all 3 of those teams. So would it really, really suck if you're the ACC, if you're Miami, if, hey, you went from 6 to 14? That would really suck. As a Syracuse fan, that would really suck, because I already think, looking at this, and I've thought before with the college football playoff rankings, like, when Syracuse beats teams that are ranked, what tends to happen is those teams fall a lot and Syracuse doesn't really move very much. And it's like, how come every time Syracuse beats a Clemson, beats a Miami, whoever it is, it says more about how bad that team is than how good Syracuse is? That always frustrates me. But that's part of the thing when you're not a perennial top 25 team that you're going to experience. But like, so, that would be really, really hard. What the heck? Miami dropped 8 spots. But you're absolutely right. Like, I don't see, the way I see it, Alabama, and it's like Alabama and Ole Miss, South Carolina is just below them. And then whether you put Miami above all 3 of those teams or Miami below all 3 of those teams is up to you. But you cannot dissect, especially Alabama and Ole Miss. You cannot split them apart. Even if you put Miami between Ole Miss and South Carolina, I'd be like, but like, okay, whatever. But especially that Alabama Ole Miss, because I think the margin is razor thin between the 2 of them. And like I said, I think the margin should go to Ole Miss, but that's just me. Yeah, I completely agree with you. Cowardly is a good way to put it.
Syracuse, too, obviously, you're a Syracuse fan, but Syracuse is in the top 25 right now, and Miami obviously dropped a big chunk of spots right out of the top 10. But Miami, like, if they had put them at 14, if they had dropped them even more, a big loss, I feel like that's trying to imply that Syracuse is a bad loss when they're a top 25 team who's beaten a bunch of bowl-eligible teams.
Yeah.
And it's like, hey, Alabama lost to Vandy. They're not here. So it feels like they're trying to penalize the teams they think are worse more for not as bad losses by any stretch. And it just feels like, why is it that you're trying to punish these teams for better losses than the ones who have worse ones? And so I'm there with you. It's frustrating.
And that's my biggest frustration with where Missouri is right now, because, again, Missouri has not beaten a top 25 team. And so, they're 9-3 right now. They have not beaten a top 25 team. They got absolutely destroyed by Texas A&M. They got blown out by Alabama, and they lost by 4 points to South Carolina. Other than that, they beat Arkansas by a touchdown. They beat Mississippi State by 19 points. They beat Oklahoma by a touchdown. They beat Auburn by 4 points. They beat Vanderbilt by 3 points. The SEC just means more. You look at what they did against their SEC opponents, it's not like they were world beaters against them. They lost to the ranked ones. They narrowly beat the bad ones, and yet they're 19. Now that makes me think, do you have them where they are because by having them there, it makes South Carolina and Alabama look better, right? Because in reality, I don't think that they deserve to be 19. I think Syracuse is better than Missouri and has a better resume than Missouri. I think you could, the same thing can be said for Illinois, and like, okay, is Illinois where they are because it makes Penn State look a little bit better because Penn State beat them. Don't get me wrong. I think both Missouri and Illinois are worthy of being in the top 25, but it's like you look at that order, it's like, why are they that high here? So it'll be really interesting to see how things play out this week with the conference championships. We'll see, like, if Clemson wins, does SMU fall out? If so, it's bogus, if you ask me, but the committee gets to do what they do, and we just have to deal with it. So it'll be fun to see. And then especially, I'm really, really excited that the first round of these playoffs are happening on college campuses. I just think that's so sick. I'm hoping Penn State gets to host a whiteout game, as a playoff. That would be the most electric thing ever,
Mhm.
So we'll see how those things play out. But thanks everybody so much for hanging out with us here as we talk college football, as we, with a lot of you, tried to understand what the committee is doing and really figured out nothing. But we'll see what happens. We'll see next week is when we'll actually hit. This is exactly what it's going to look like, and we'll see what happens. So thank you all so much for watching, for subscribing, and for supporting us. Have a good one, everybody.